video, I'd like to give you an introduction to using the new pangolin-journal module that we're introducing in Backlight 4. On screen, I've got an album set that I've pre-populated with 14 albums. These are empty, so if you see me click into them by mistake, there's nothing in there. All I've done is I've created the albums and I've assigned them a cover image. And the images themselves are pretty random. I've got 14 just because that's, I feel, a good number to work with the starter template that we're going to be looking at if you've got everything turned on. But yeah, with that said, let's jump into it. So on the right hand side, I've got Backlight 4. I'm looking at the template list. And to create a new Pangolin Journal template, we go to the Album Set Template section, click the Create New Template button, and then select Pangolin Journal as the type. Oop, I forgot to give it a name. Default journal. Add that, and then go to Publisher. I'm going to dive into the set that we're working with, and I'm going to assign that template to be used. So when I refresh, we are now looking at the default for Pangolin Journal. Everything is pretty flat. It all looks, every item is treated the same. And from here, what you would do back in the designer, you start designing. But this is honestly not the best way to get started, because there are a lot of sliders, a lot of options, a lot of things to think about and change. And so if you want to work from a blank slate, this is the way to go. But if you're approaching this as a new user, which everyone is because we're just releasing it as a brand new item in Backlight 4, I actually would recommend starting with the starter template. So to get that, back on the templates page, you click this green button at the top, download template presets, and you're going to find the journal starter template available there. It's not there at the moment because we haven't launched yet, but I've already got it installed. It's the journal starter. So let me go back to my publisher. And now that we know how to create a default set and what that looks like, or a default journal and what that looks like, I'm going to change this to use the starter. And what that is going to give us is some pre-configured blocks that we can work with. So this idea of a block is fundamental to Pangolin Journal. Both the block itself and then whether or not that block repeats after it's been used for the first time. Let's walk through the page. So the first item on the page, album number 1, is a single album in a block. It's a full width block that has only one column and contains one album. And so we get the item taking up the full width of the page. When I scroll down, we have a second block, and this contains albums 2 and 3. This is a full width block with 2 columns containing 2 albums. Scrolling down further, this row, loosely used word row, is actually 2 blocks. So on the left-hand side, there's this blue picture of Hong Kong. This is one block that contains one album, but it is set to be just 65% of the width. And then the other 35% of the width is a fourth block, and this contains 2 albums in one column and takes up 35% of the screen. And that allows it to sit next to its sibling here on the left that takes up the other 65. Scrolling down again, we have exactly the same proportions and the same arrangement of blocks, except they're reversed, so that the block on the left is the 35% width single column with two albums, and then the one on the right is the remaining 65% width, one column containing one album. Scrolling down further, we have the final block, and this is sort of our catch-all. So as many more albums as we throw into this are going to be caught up in this final block because it's the only one that I've set to repeat in the starter template. And we'll get into that concept of repeating momentarily. But this is a block that contains a maximum of 6 items. There's only 5 here because I guess I need to put one more album into the set. But a full width block divided into 3 columns containing 6 albums. And then this one is set up to repeat, so that if I had 12 more, then I would have 2 instances of this block. So the easiest way to get into this concept of repeating blocks is for me to start turning a few things off so that we have more albums falling into the leftover set. So let me turn off the second. Well, I'll just turn them all off. Let's turn off the first as well. The third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. The seventh is already off because we're not using it. And then we have the eighth, which is on and also repeats. So if I save that, what we have now looks a lot like if you were using the iconic presentation type in Pangolin album set. And if you're only planning to use one block, you should just go use Pangolin album set, switch on the iconic presentation, and design that way. It's a simpler module to use, and you'll get exactly these results. Where you want to start using Pangolin-journal is when you want to have more than one block with a different design. So again, this is a block of 6 that repeats. So we've got albums 1 through 6 are the first instance of the block, and then 7 through 12 are the second instance of the block, and then 13 and 14 are beginning a third instance of the block, but it's not a full block. So I hope that makes sense. The way that the repeating works is that, we've got 8 blocks, and on the first pass, all 8 of them will be rendered if they're turned on. So if I turn on the first block again, it's going to appear first because it's the first block. And then 2 through 7 are disabled, so they're not displaying. And then we get into the 8th. But important to take note, block 1 does not repeat. So it shows the first time, and then after that, everything falls into the repeating block. If I turn on the second block, it also does not repeat. So I've got 1, then 2, and then the third block, which is actually configured under the 8th. Again, I'm sorry for all the confusing numbers. But you can see that it's the one that repeats. We've got the first 6 are the first instance of that block, and then we start a second instance of that block. So what happens if I set the second block to also repeat? So again, we're using the first, the second, and the 8th. The first does not repeat. So again, we only see that once. Then we see block number 2. And then we see the 8th block, which is the repeating one. But then we see the second block again, then the 8th, because they both are set to repeat. So they'll repeat indefinitely in sequence until they run out of albums. Whereas if a block does not repeat, it will be used one time only, and then it will stop. Okay, let's do a little work. The first thing I'm going to do is just turn everything off. And that way I can show you what happens when nothing is turned on at all. When all the blocks are disabled, what's going to happen is there's nothing going to be on the page. You need to have at least one block configured to display anything. So throughout Backlight, we typically recommend a top to bottom workflow. So in the designer, that would mean that you would begin with breadcrumbs, work through the controls to hero image, work through those, and just work your way down the module until you're fully designed. And I suppose that still applies insofar as breadcrumbs, hero image, copy, and then the album set. And we do need to look at this. But in pangolin-journal, we are going to break from the norm. And what I advise is that when you're beginning, you skip the 1st through 7th blocks and you enable the 8th block first and set it to repeat. And the reason is because that's going to be the catch-all. Everything that doesn't fall into one of the blocks above is going to land in this final repeating block. And that way, we're not missing any of our content. Because as you saw, when nothing is enabled, nothing's going to show up. Likewise, if nothing repeats, you're only going to get as many albums as you've designed. So you know I've got 14 albums, but I'm only displaying one block with 6 that doesn't repeat. So we only get the first 6, and then the other 8 are lost. So you do want to have sort of a catch-all bucket at the end. So we begin with the 8th block, and then we're going to design above it. So let me, excuse me, get that turned back on. Let's dip into album set for just a moment. So these are global or common controls. This allows you to set defaults. Not especially useful when you're working with the journal starter template, but if you're working from a blank slate, creating your own template, this is where you'd want to begin, because this allows you to set some common defaults that will be used by all of the blocks. And then you can override these for each individual block if you want to, but this gives you sort of a global place to start. So we have the margin top and the gutters, which affect the album set entirely, but then starting from block commons, these are the defaults for each individual block. So yeah, there's nothing in here I want to change, again, because we are working from the starter template, but it's important that you know this is here. This is where you would want to begin working, as long as you have at least one block that is configured, or switched on, rather. And then, after setting sort of these common settings and getting things into a place where it begins to look the way you want, then you move into the individual blocks and start customizing things. So let's get into the 8th block and walk through some of the basics here. So the first slider is the block width, and by default is 100%, which means it's going to take up the entire width of your layout, which is typically what we want. If I take this down to about 50, and then I save the changes, you'll see that it's, well, what's happening now is because it's 50. So this, I'm getting this first block of 6. You can follow my mouse, 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6 in the second row. Then it goes back to the first row for 7, 8, 9, then 10, 11, 12, because this is actually 2 blocks. So it does the first block of 6 and then repeats another block of 6 and then falls down to the next row for the next block. So let me actually, I don't know, we'll go 75% because I think that'll illustrate things a little more clearly. What happens when you don't take up the full width? So now we've got all this leftover space because we're only using 75%. So what I would want to do then is I would want to create a following block that takes up the other 25% because I want to fill that space. Anyway, so block width for the last one, I want it to be 100%. And then we have a breakpoint, full width at 640. Now, if this is 100%, this does nothing. But if it were 75, and let me just set this at a different value, 992. So 75% with above 992, but then for responsive stuff, when I fall down, it goes to full width. And this would be, the 992 is basically for when you're holding an iPad in vertical orientation. That's what you're going to get. So every block has its own responsive rules that can be set, and this is the first one, this full width at. So setting it to 640 basically ensures that whatever else you do when you get onto a mobile phone, the block itself will be full width. Margin top and margin bottom have a default value of -1. This is not actually a negative value. What this does is it's telling it to ignore this slider. When a slider goes to -1, setting it to -1 will force that block to use whatever rules you've set under block commons. So block commons has margin top and bottom both set to 0. And by setting the individual block sliders to -1, we're going to use those common values. Not every slider goes to -1 because not every slider is represented in the common settings. But if a slider does go to -1, that's the reason. Okay, background color. You can set the background color on a block. So, I mean, pretty obvious, but important to know because we get down to albums within block, then we have another background color, and then you can set the background for the individual items. And then if I use some margin between them to illustrate what this actually does, there we go. So the block itself has a background of red, but each individual item has a background of yellow. Basic color customization stuff. I don't think I need to delve too deeply into it, but I just wanted to show that, the background color, a lot of these things may look at first glance to be redundant. It's like, oh, there's margin sliders and background color here. There's margin sliders and background color here. How are they different? Well, this first one, albums block, this applies to the entire block. And then albums within block, these settings apply to the individual albums that are contained within it. So after we've configured the block itself, we come down to the albums within the block, and then this applies to individual items. So we have the number of albums. This is a very important slider. This is set to 6. Why? It's 3 columns. So why don't I just say, well, okay, let's do 3 per block, and then it's going to look exactly the same, right? It's updated. Yes, it looks exactly the same. So why am I using 6 instead of 3? The reason is when we get down to columns at screen breakpoints, I have my responsive rules say that when we get down to 992, we use 2 per block, or rather 2 columns instead of 3 columns. So let's go there and see what happens. So because it's only 3 per block, it's giving us a block with 2 columns and 3 albums, and then it's repeating that. So you can see, pretty obviously, we get this blank space. I don't like that. So that's the reason I use 6 for this one. When I want it to be 3 columns, I use 6 across, specifically because I do have this breakpoint where it's going to 2 columns. And then that allows it to repeat seamlessly. So let's go back to our full. This is why I like to divide my screen like this. So this is what it would look like on a mobile phone. This is what it looks like on a vertical iPad. And then this is what it looks like on a horizontal iPad and above. And that's all because I'm setting the number of columns at these screen breakpoints. These are the responsive layout rules. So albums within block, the number of albums is probably the most important slider in here. And then we get into just, you can put borders around the items, you can apply padding, margins between them, all the normal stuff. Cover image. These are the options for the thumbnails themselves. So I am using 16:9 aspect ratios. I could change that to 2:1 if I want them to be wide but not as tall. I could change it to 1:1 if I want these to be squares. You can set the aspect ratio separately for larger widths and then mobile. So the mobile aspect ratio will apply when we fall under 736. So again, that's basically anything smaller than a portrait orientation iPad. borders, border radius. Use hero image. You can, like by default, this uses the cover image, but you can tell it to use the hero image instead. And that might be useful if, like, right now we're doing 3 columns, so these are relatively small thumbnails. So maybe for the cover image for each album, I set that to be a small thumbnail. But if I'm using this first block, this is a full width thing. So if this were a small thumbnail, that would mean that this is way too large a display for a tiny thumbnail. So maybe I want to, instead of using the cover image for the album, when an album is taking up the block 1 space, I want to use the hero image instead. And then the hero image can be a larger version of the image, and then the cover image can be a smaller one, so that if I publish something new in this space and this gets pushed down into here, then it starts using the cover image instead. So that just gives you some flexibility in controlling the size of the images that you are using to, as your representative image for that album. And then we have the override common album info styling. So again, if we go back up to the album set, under common, we have the block info section where we can control like font sizes for titles and descriptions. And this is actually the only place where we customize the publish dates. That's not available for individual blocks. If we wanted to override that, then we would turn them on here, and then we get all the album info controls for this block. But it's a lot, so we hide them away when we don't want to override it because it's just easier to visually parse. So that's basically how you configure a block. The last thing we have are headings, and this allows you to put a heading above a block, and these will only be used for the first occurrence of each block, meaning that headings do not repeat. So I could, for the first, apply a heading that is like featured item, and then for the 8th, everything else. And then you've got some styling options for the headings. Let me just save those. So, these are out of line. I do want to apply some padding on the left and right. Probably, I think 9 is going to do it. There we go. So now it's in line. So you can see now it says featured item above here. If I come down, here's everything else. Here's the first block. The block repeats, but there is not another heading. Again, the heading only gets used the first time. So you can use this to give the different sections of the layout their own titles. And all you have to do, there's not an on-off toggle. It's either blank or it has something. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And again, we've got all these pre-configured options. So if, for example, you don't want all the stuff in between, you just want one big one and then this repeating block, then it would be really easy to get started. You would just have the first one on, disable everything in between, and then have the 8th on and repeat. If you decide that you want to have this, then you just turn that on. I don't want to repeat it. But then I'm not using, there's 4 blocks that do the 65-35 splits, and I have those turned off. So I can very quickly achieve a layout like this using this starter template. Yeah, so I'm going to call this video here. I think that's a good overall look at some of the basic concepts. I think I'll probably do a follow-up video that is more advanced and will probably be longer, where I begin with a blank slate and maybe go through designing an entire layout from scratch. But that'll be another video. So look for that follow-up. And in the meantime, I hope this gives you a good overview of the basic principles and how you can get started using the journal starter template that will be available when Backlight 4 releases. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.